I can barely see you.
I know. We're blinded by the light up here. Good?
All right. Thank you, friends, for joining us tonight here at Westlake United Methodist Church for a conversation with Reverend Dr. Mark Holland, Executive Director of Mainstream UMC, one of our outstanding centrist organizations working to help the church move forward into the next century. Dr. Holland, would you open us with prayer?
Yeah, let us pray. Good and gracious God, we thank you for gathering us here tonight. We say a prayer for all of those who have gathered in this room and for those who are gathering online, that you might open our hearts and minds for a conversation and a dialogue about how to best move our church forward during these particularly challenging times. We ask that you will pour out your grace and your wisdom and your kindness on all of us, that we might truly love one another. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. Mark, I think it'd be good if we started with a brief description of what Mainstream UMC is.
Well, that's right. Well, thank you. And thanks to Jay Brim for coordinating this. And Jay's a board member for Mainstream UMC. And appreciate your work on the board and a member here at Westlake. So appreciate your coordinating this. And I want to thank Pastor Tracy for hosting and for everyone who's here at the church at Westlake that's helped make this happen. So Mainstream UMC started in 2018 as in an effort to pass the One Church plan. So in 2016, the General Conference was coming apart at the seams, and one of the things that had just happened is there was a committee meeting, and there was a petition that said we should spend some money, the United Methodist Church should put some money in to help prevent teen suicide among LGBTQ teenagers, because they have about 5 times the chance of suicide as folks who do not identify as gay. And that effort failed. The petition died in committee. And there was so much anger and frustration because there were groups advocating every vote we took at General Conference, and I've been there since 2000, and you've been there before that. 96. So every General Conference, every vote on about every issue became an up or down vote on homosexuality. You're either pro-gay or you're anti-gay. And that petition died in that conversation. And so I had a chance to make a motion to ask the bishops to lead us forward in this conflict around human sexuality. And there was a vote. It barely passed by like 25 votes. It passed. The bishops came back with a proposal. That proposal barely passed. And the proposal was they'd put together a commission on the way forward, and they worked for 18 months and came back with the One Church plan, which was sort of a regional plan in terms of, and the idea was you be you and we'll be us. And what the One Church plan really did is it codified who we really are already as United Methodists. Because the United Methodists are sort of the chameleon of the denominations. You know, in the Northeast, we look a lot like the Episcopalians. In the South, we look and sound a lot like the Baptists. In the North, we sound a lot like the Lutherans. In fact, I have a friend who's a United Methodist pastor in Wisconsin, and she did a 3-year confirmation class. Because that's what the Lutherans did. And I said, that's what everybody expected. I said, look, our kids in Kansas City are so smart, we can do it in 6 weeks. But I don't know what's wrong with your kids up there. But then the Methodist Church in California looks and sounds a lot like California. And the One Church plan said, we're just going to be who we are. The South's going to be more conservative. The West and Northeast are going to be more progressive. Everyone can just be who they are, and we'll live together. That was the One Church plan. Well, as that One Church plan was rolled out, there was a group that said, we're not going to have that. We're going to have the traditional plan. So they wrote the traditional plan, which was to ramp up the trials, to kick out gay pastors and their allies, and forcibly kick out the folks, ramp up all the rules and regulations. And Mainstream looked at this coming, and it was June of 2018. And General Conference, a special session that the bishops called, was going to be in January of 2019, or February, right in there. And the mainstream, there were several of us that said, well, who's going to help get this passed? Because the bishops aren't going to run a PR campaign. They're not going to advertise for their own plan and push for it. They felt like they had to be neutral. I'm like, this is no time for neutral. This is time for advocacy. So we co-founded with my friend, Reverend Dr. Nanette Roberts at Olathe United Methodist Church. She was a senior pastor there in Great Plains Conference. And she and I said, we're going to co-found Mainstream to serve in many ways as the PAC that's going to push advocacy to help persuade delegates, because it's a political election, right? General Conference is 862 delegates. We didn't pick the format. We inherited it. And to paraphrase our Lord, where two or more are gathered, there will be politics also. And so we thought we ought to get involved to help persuade the delegates to vote for this. So that's how Mainstream started. Disappointed in 19, we worked for advocacy to do new elections in 20, or in that spring, and I'll say more about that later. But and then we continued to work getting ready for the 2020 General Conference. And then when that was postponed, we really stopped our work for about 3 years. There wasn't much work to do. And so our board came back in January and said, would you look into restarting? So we did and the board in May of this year voted unanimously to restart Mainstream UMC, to get this advocacy working again. And we are basically a PR firm doing advocacy to try to pass priorities that are going to move the church forward. And now we have new legislation. The one church plan is dead and gone. And now we're pushing for some priorities of regionalization and removing the harmful language. Those are our primary, and there's some layers to that, but those are our primary goals right now. So,
well, let's outline what regionalization is so that people understand the concept and how it's going to help us move forward as a church.
The short version is, and I don't usually get accused of giving the short
No,
version.
you don't, but
The short,
that's what I'm here for.
That's right, you're here to keep it shorter. The short version is, we need to move from global governance to global mission.
Yeah.
Right now we have a global governance structure. We're the only church in the world that's trying to do global governance. No other denomination does it in a democratic way. The Presbyterians, Lutherans, Episcopalians, Christian, everybody else has the U.S. governance, and they have governance outside the U.S. in different parts of the world. The Catholic Church has an international structure, but it's not a democratic process. So we're the only ones trying to do a global democratic process, and it's not working for us. No. In the short version, it's not working for us. So regionalization is an effort to allow the U.S. to be its own region, and the different parts, Europe, Africa, Philippines, to be their own regions. The history of this is interesting. Prior to 1980, 6% of the delegates from General Conference were from outside the United States. It's 45% now, and in 4 years it'll be 55%. A dramatic change happened in the 80s and 90s, and it changed in this way. Prior to the 80s and 90s, when we would send missionaries around the world, and when those churches would grow to a certain size, they would become autonomous Methodist churches. Provisional annual conferences, they become annual conference, and then become autonomous Methodists. So all of the Methodist churches in Mexico, the Caribbean, Central America, and South America are all autonomous because they all came of age before the 80s. All of India, China, Korea, Australia are all autonomous Methodists because, again, they came of age. Now, Australia actually came out of the British church, so we never had anything to do with them. But that group is autonomous as well. So all these groups were autonomous, and then in the 80s, rather than as these churches grew outside the United States, instead of spinning them off to autonomous, started retaining them in the United Methodist structure. Now, there are about 10 million Methodists in Africa. 5 million of those are United Methodist. The other 5 million are autonomous Methodists that came of age before the 80s and were already autonomous. So we have this later group, and there were 3 reasons really why there was a decision made to start retaining folks rather than making them autonomous. One is a good reason. The other 2 required different levels of cynicism. So see how cynical you're feeling tonight. The good, legitimate reason is because the United Methodist Church in the United States is about 90% white, white middle class. And so adding global diversity matters, and I think we're a stronger church. A more diverse church is a better church. And so adding that global diversity matters. But the other 2 reasons, one, starting in 1965, the United Methodist Church in the United States started to decline. Now, I prefer to say this when my dad's present. I'm a 3rd-generation pastor. It correlates exactly when my dad came out of seminary. Now, I can't blame him entirely for the decline of the church, but there's no questioning that's when it started. But in 1965, the church started to decline. Well, if we retained churches from outside the United States, we were no longer a declining denomination, we were a growing denomination. The third reason is there were some folks at General Conference that realized these are reliably conservative votes. That if we retain these persons, we will have a more conservative church, disproportionate to what the U.S. is doing. So if you probably know, if you have friends in the Lutheran, Episcopalian, Presbyterian churches, all ordained gay and lesbian pastors 12 and 16 years ago. If it had been a U.S.-only vote, the Methodists would have had ordination and marriage for LGBTQ persons 12 or 16 years ago. But because of our interesting global structure, we have not been able to do that. We are the largest denomination in the world that ordains women that does not ordain gay and lesbian pastors. So, and it's a similar reading of Scripture. It's a similar reading of Scripture in that I believe the whole Bible's true. Much of it is descriptive truth for what was true for them then, and much of it is prescriptive truth for how we should live today. Everyone, frankly, agrees with that. I haven't met the person yet that's thought Deuteronomy 22 is prescriptive for us. When a woman's raped, she has to marry the rapist forever. That's descriptive truth right there. But the argument comes with who decides what this particular passage is it descriptive or prescriptive. That's where the fight comes in. So the situation in our church now is 45% of the votes are from outside the United States. And this issue primarily is a U.S. issue. And what we're trying to do is break apart the governance so we're not over each other. What we did for years ago, and I need to know the year when paragraph 101 was adopted. Paragraph 101 was adopted that said that churches outside the United States could adapt the Book of Discipline to meet their cultural needs. That permission is not reciprocated to the U.S. church. So it was an effort for the majority church not to oppress, if you will, the minority church. Well, now that the tables have turned, regionalization gives the U.S. the same permission to adapt the Book of Discipline in a way that we need to adapt it in this country. That's what regionalization is about, but it's complicated.
And I think we also ought to point out that it's not just the huge political issues that our friends from outside the U.S. have to stand around and listen to us argue about. We have a deeply complicated system of church governance in the United States with district superintendents and lots of church parsonages and things like that, whereas many places in Africa, the DS doesn't get paid and rides a bicycle from village to village. So they listen to us have extended discussions about real estate issues in the Book of Discipline, and they say, why aren't we here to praise God and find disciples? So there's more to it than just the big political issues. There are reasons that we need to get the issues that apply in this area done in this area and not waste our opportunity to build the global church that we have and do it in a way that is going to ultimately lead to more disciples.
That's right. Tell me, you've been on the delegation here for a long time and active here at Westlake. How has this conversation impacted the local church and the local conference?
Well, in our church here in Westlake, we started 10 years ago talking about this issue primarily because we had a founding member of Westlake United Methodist Church who had to live in the closet for her entire time as a member here. And she, after the age of 90, shared with our Sunday school class her journey. And it was an affecting story that we shared throughout the church, and it led to this church saying, we're open to everyone, and we believe that that's the way we all ought to love and live. And it made it easy for Westlake United Methodist Church because we had somebody we could identify with who had a story that really spoke to us. Now, throughout Austin, of course, Austin being a college city, a much more progressive city, we've got many congregations in Austin who have found their own way to the same idea of open membership and welcoming presence. And we're proud of that. We're glad of that. We're having to work hard to raise the rest of our conference's level of consciousness about this, as you might expect. We are, after all, only a couple of 100 miles from the nest of vipers that started the whole traditionalist movement there in North Houston, and it's been a contest of wills over the last 20 years for us to continue to have an open attitude about who we can be as a church.
Yeah. Well, what we've seen across the country, the traditional plan included a paragraph 2553, which allowed for disaffiliations. It allowed for a temporary suspension of the trust clause. The trust clause is that rule that John Wesley put in that said all the property is held in common by the annual conference, and every local church is owned by the annual conference collectively. And so if a church wants to leave, historically, they have to buy their property or abandon it. And so 2553 actually created a clause that allowed for churches to leave. Churches who disagreed with the church's stance on homosexuality. The only reason you could use paragraph 2553 is for the issue of homosexuality. And paragraph 2053 was adopted at General Conference in 2019. The expectation is that the liberals would use it. That we've taken over the church and the liberals are leaving, and so this is they called it the gracious exit. Well, it was adopted by the traditional majority, and then they have been the ones who have used it and have complained that it's not very gracious. But paragraph 2553 has impacted church conferences around the country in very different ways. It's been heavily used in the South. Texas has been hit hard as a state. Not every conference equally. The North Texas Conference has probably been spared the most of it.
Yep.
And the divisions we've found are the same demographic divisions we have in our country. The South, much more conservative. Northeast and Northwest, the coasts are much more progressive. And then the rural-urban divide, which you have right here in Texas. And we have in Kansas, in the Great Plains Conference, which is Kansas and Nebraska. So in Great Plains, for instance, we had 1,000 churches and 25% disaffiliated. But in our conference, that 25% is 250 churches. But the 250 churches only represented 4% of our attendance and 4% of our budget. Because they were the rural churches in Kansas and Nebraska that left. And we only lost 2 churches that had more than 400 in attendance. So the city churches all stayed. Many of the rural churches left. And that's been true across the country. Now, when you get into Mississippi, Alabama, Florida, Texas, you saw more urban churches leaving as well. But how hard they were hit varies dramatically across. But it looks like right now about 6,000 churches have disaffiliated. That might grow to 7,000 before the end of the year. 2553, paragraph 2553 is set to sunset December 31st of this year. And disaffiliations are over. for most of us. But there is the groups, the conservative advocacy groups, the Institute for Religion and Democracy, which is as far radical right as you can go. They believe the National Council of Churches is a Marxist organization. It's on their website, I mean, really. So they're way out to lunch on the right. But that group, and they don't really care about growing a new denomination. They're institutional nihilists. They believe that we're in a post-denominational Christianity, and so they have a branch in the Presbyterian Church, Methodist Church, Episcopalian Church, Lutheran Church. They have a branch in each denomination trying to break up every denomination. And it's run by a former member of the CIA. So that, which is in his bio on the website. So that group is coming to General Conference because they want to continue to split up the United Methodist Church. The Good News and Westlake Covenant Association that are housed out of the Woodlands in Houston and the Global Methodist Church are wanting to continue the disaffiliation so that they can get more churches for their denomination. So it's driven by self-interest, and they are coming to General Conference. Many of their members have left, disaffiliated, but there's a group coming to General Conference with the intent of continuing 2553, or a new version of it, to allow the disaffiliations to continue. And one of the things we're working on at Mainstream is to say no to continuing 2553. It's time for us to move, as a pastor in my conference said, it's time for us to move from a conflict-driven church to a mission-driven church. And we've been so locked in this conflict for so many years.
Yes.
It's time for us to move forward with focusing on the mission. And so so we do have, and a lot of people think it's over. Well, they all disaffiliated, so we're going to come to General Conference and it's going to be a kumbaya moment. No, it's not. That's the short version. No, it's not. There is a group coming to continue to divide the church, and we need to educate delegates about that. We need to educate people in the pews about that. We need to educate pastors about that, that we're not out of the woods yet, that this General Conference in 2024 has the potential to be as contentious as any in terms of how the voting goes, which is not good news.
Yeah.
And if
No pun intended.
thank you.
Yeah.
And if you had at the annual conference in Great Plains, it was a treat. It was the best feeling we've had at annual conference in a generation. Everybody's on the same page. The folks who had disaffiliated had left, and it was folks who wanted to be there. Folks who wanted to be in the United Methodist Church were there. That's the group we want. And that's not all of who's coming to the General Conference. So,
Well, let's talk about that for a minute, because part of what happened out of St. Louis after the abysmal ending that we all suffered through and the disappointment that we had, that we did not succeed in moving forward, we came back and elected new delegations for 2020. And you started this discussion. Here in Rio, Texas, we elected the youngest, most diverse delegation, other than the old white guy, that we'd ever had in Rio, Texas. And that was true across our jurisdiction, was it not?
it was. What we saw after we did a lot of vote counting for 2019. We know that 2/3 of the U.S. delegates were supporting the one church plan. The voting for the one church plan failed by 50 votes. We needed 26 people to change their minds. The traditional plan passed by 50 votes. Now, if you're a pastor and you're going to do a capital campaign and you had a 50% vote, would you move forward? Or would you regroup and start the work over again? Right? Moving forward with something as aggressive as a traditional plan with 50 vote margin is dubious at best. But what they did is they won the vote and they lost the church because people were so outraged at the traditional plan. But after 2019, well, we also know more statistics about 2019. 2/3 of the U.S. voted for the one church plan, which tells us in 2019, 2/3 of the U.S. church was ready to live with difference. Not 2/3 progressive, but 2/3 willing to live with people who think
Big
differently
tent.
than they do.
Big tent.
Crazy idea, right? Of actually, we do it in our families, don't we? I don't know what your Thanksgiving table looks like. Of we're going to find out again. I do say this about Thanksgiving, since Thanksgiving is almost upon us. It's my favorite holiday. You don't have to buy a card. You don't have to buy gifts, right? You don't have to buy candy. And it's a day that reminds us why we all live in different houses. Amen? I mean, it's a beautiful holiday. It's a gift to us. But this idea of the traditional plan is we can't live together. And we do it in our local churches. I've never been to a local church where everyone was on the same page. No. We live together in our families. We live together in our local churches. And even our annual conferences, we've lived with this difference. It's at the national level that we can't get along. Does that sound like America right now?
Well, carrying forward from these new groups, these younger, more diverse groups, so many of them have never been to a general conference, and they're not familiar
That's right.
with what the politics are. So part of what we've got to work on, that mainstream's got to work on, is try to help all of these young American delegates understand what the process is and what the challenges are, and to be patient as we work through it.
That's right.
In North Carolina.
That's right. And I think we went from the 2/3 U.S. vote. We know that the traditional plan passed. 60% of the votes that came for the traditional plan came from Africa. 9 out of 10 African delegates voted for the traditional plan. After our elections in 2019, that spring, just a few months later, we went from 2/3 of the U.S. delegates supporting it to 3/4. So we picked up the 26 people we needed a few months later to go to 2020 and change the language. Well, 2020 got postponed. Then, with the rash of disaffiliations we've had, about 20% of the church, 6,000 churches out of 31,000 in the United States, 20% of the churches have disaffiliated, and most of those delegates have resigned from the delegation. Not all. Most have resigned from their delegations because they're no longer part of the United Methodist Church. They don't want to be. They want to grow the global Methodist Church. So we have picked up, and annual conference is re-elected. Alabama has an entire slate, lay and clergy, of centrists and progressives now. In Alabama, right? That we didn't see that coming. But we've picked up additional votes, and the way the general conference vote count is decided is it was baked in 2019 when we voted. So the fact that the United States is 20% smaller, we still have all of those votes. So we have a disproportionate number of votes that we're going to have in any general conference ever again. And the way that African church has grown so fast that the general conference has stepped in their representation. So they are not proportionally represented yet the way that the U.S. churches are. So this is our last general conference where centrists and progressives will have a majority vote at general conference. And because in 2 years, the next time they count, Africa will be fully represented. The U.S. will be fully represented at 80% instead of 100%. And we'll go from 55% of the votes to 45% of the votes. That's a significant change. And we have new delegates from 2019 and new delegates from recently to fill in the disaffiliations. Many of whom are of the generation, like my kids, they're like, well, why are we even talking about this? Well, we have a whole generation in this country that doesn't even know why we're talking about this. And the reality of coming to general conference is a little jarring to hear speeches on the floor of general conference from people around the world saying things you would never say out loud in the United States. It's just, it can be horrifying. But there are 26 countries in Africa where we have United Methodist churches. In 16 of those countries, homosexuality is illegal. So it's an apples and oranges conversation in terms of what we're trying to talk about. That is a big part of the culture gap. So what we're trying to do is educate delegates, inform delegates, advocate to delegates, and help push this regionalization, because this regionalization is going to be the key. But here's the hard part about it. To remove the language requires 50% plus 1, right? Removing the language is a 50% vote. We probably have those votes at this general conference, based on the elections I just told you about. We probably have those votes to change the language. Regionalization requires 8 constitutional amendments. which require a 2/3 vote at General Conference, and, more importantly, 2/3 votes in the annual conferences. And the way the Book of Discipline says that is it says 2/3 votes of all annual conference members present and voting. Well, I just described how the U.S. has a disproportionate number of votes right now. We have 45%. Well, that's got to be ratified in the next year if it passes at General Conference. We're going to have 45% of the ratification votes. We have 55% of the General Conference votes. We're going to have 45% of the ratification votes. It's going to make it very difficult. Regionalization passed in 2008 at General Conference. The constitutional amendments failed to be ratified. In 2016, the constitutional amendment was passed, radical. It said women are equal to men in the eyes of God. Crazy. Got the 2/3 vote at General Conference and failed to get ratified. So there's no slam dunk that because we pass something at General Conference that regionalization will become law. So one of the things we're working on is what happens if it doesn't pass, but that's another part of the conversation.
But just so that there is a balanced understanding of this, what is happening over the water in our other Methodist churches and central conferences is an evolving situation. The Africans are understanding slowly what's going on here in terms of what the division has been in the United States, and they recognize that what they have as a general church in Africa is dependent upon the United States succeeding and continuing to have a strong general church. So we're beginning to hear and see support from places in Africa that will help us break through that unilateral response that was actually, we believe, generally generated by many individuals who had worked the African continent for 20 to 30 years to build the conservative block of votes that they got. To the extent those individuals are moving into a different church now, we're hopeful that we'll begin to see some change. So we've got to both be realistic about how to fight through our challenges in North Carolina, but then also be hopeful about what we can say to all of these churches in the central conferences about what needs to be done so that we can have a strong international church.
And this is the tension. The tension right now is the U.S. church very much wants to remove the harmful language and prohibitions against gay clergy and gay marriage. We want to remove those prohibitions. And it's simply removing the language. We're very careful to say no one's moving towards changing the language into affirmation. We just want to go back to neutral. Wouldn't that be something? So that's the goal of moving. That vote of change, taking out the language, which includes what was put in 1972. 1972 was a special general conference. They decided in 1972 to remove the prohibitions against divorced clergy and add the prohibitions for gay clergy, right? Biblical interpretation. So in 1972, the language was added that said homosexuality is incompatible with Christian teaching. And there's been an effort every single year to remove that language, and we haven't succeeded in removing it yet. But removing that language creates tension in the African churches because they believe in Africa that homosexuality is incompatible with Christian teaching, and they don't want to change the language. They also want to continue to be in relationship to the U.S. church. So I have emails from 3 different bishops in Africa who have all said, we are staying United Methodist if the language doesn't change. We're staying United Methodist if the language doesn't change. So there's a tension. If we vote to remove the language at General Conference, I advocate that we should. It may be our last opportunity. We absolutely should remove the language at General Conference. We have the majority vote. We need to remove it. Does that anger the folks in Africa who say we're going to vote against regionalization now? Or does it create motivation for folks in Africa to say, my gosh, we've got to get regionalization so we can create some distance with this church? The jury is out which of those is true. they might both be true at the same time. It might be paradoxical that it's hurting us and helping us. But the other piece that becomes very unpopular.
Before we leave that.
Yeah, go ahead.
And y'all may have picked this up as we were talking about it. The central conferences already get to pick and choose what they want out of the Book of Discipline. There is actually one central conference that's using the 1984 Book of Discipline. They can keep the language we take out.
That's right.
And they apparently are not aware of that.
Well, and that's part of the messaging.
We have to work on that.
We have to work on that, is to let folks know. Now, we did offer to the traditionalists in the U.S. a regional plan where your church and your annual conference can continue to be conservative, and our other churches will be progressive, other churches will be centrist. And the traditionalists in the U.S. said no to that. They said no to living in a denomination with that difference in interpretation around the scriptures. The question is, will the African traditionalists, who are every bit as traditional as the U.S. church and maybe more, be willing to say regionalization creates enough distance for them to be successful? Because what will happen, and I've heard this from folks in Africa, the Pentecostal church next door is going to say that Cross and Flame is pro-gay, and that's a pro-gay church, so you should come to our church. And no matter how much they disavow it and say, no, we've made a statement that says we're against that, they're concerned that the competition of other churches in Africa will point to that, and they will lose membership because of the stance that the U.S. church has taken. One thing I would say maybe is the answer, maybe. One thing I would say, though, the U.S. church is ready to change the language, and frankly cannot live under the language we have now any longer. And that's true of 80% of the U.S. church is ready to change language. They're done fighting about this. And I would say gay and lesbian people are tired of being the focus of this conversation, at no fault of their own, are ready for the church to fight about something else. Because it's just not fair to single out one group of people. So the U.S. church is done and ready to move forward. I believe this. Win or lose, the U.S. church is not going back to trials. The U.S. church is openly ordaining gay and lesbian pastors and is openly doing weddings. The churches that want to do that and are going to continue to do that. Mm-hmm. No matter what the Book of Discipline says. And we could put in there that every church has to welcome a gay pastor. And Africa is not going to do it, even if the discipline told them to. So we've reached a détente, right? We are who we are. You are who you are. The question is, do we want to stay in the same church so we can share mission? Because the most unpopular part of this conversation is about money. Because the tie that binds might not be Jesus. It might be the money. And the money situation makes people uncomfortable because pre-COVID, the global Methodist budget was $135 million a year. Pre-COVID, $135 million a year. 99.6% of that came from the 31,000 U.S. churches. 99.6%. And we're 45% of the church. I don't think there's anybody who's liberal enough or conservative enough to turn over their checkbook to another group. That just doesn't seem likely. But when you start talking about money, you start talking about power and colonialism. Is it fair that the U.S. church is rich? It is not fair. It is not just. It is what it is. And we have an $8 billion pension fund. $8 billion pension fund, 90+% is for U.S. pastors and bishops. So there's a whole elephant in the room, which is the finances. And there's the issue of homosexuality. And those two are playing together right now. And there's nothing that mixes like money and sex to get people in the church upset. But those are the two biggest issues that are coming at General Conference.
Boy, you look like you've come right to the end of it right here.
Well, that's the bottom line in some ways. It's the bottom line in some ways. What do you think in terms of disaffiliations from Rio, Texas perspective, and the state of Texas?
Well,
what is your thought on the continuing of disaffiliations and versus not continuing disaffiliations?
I can tell you that our bishop has taken a very graceful position on this. He has said that churches that do not want to continue to be United Methodist have a way to do that, and as long as they'll follow the pathway that's been set up by a board of trustees, he will bless them and hope that they have success in making disciples. And at this point, we have had, out of our 355 churches, fewer than 100 that have left, which we consider successful given how close we are to the Good News and Wesleyan Covenant people in Houston. That's what's interesting about it, and y'all probably have noticed this, is that of all these churches that are leaving, less than half of them are joining the Global Methodist Church. They're leaving to be community churches or whatever they want to call themselves. And it'll be very interesting to see a generation from now or a half a generation from now whether these churches realize that the lack of support they have as a totally freestanding church is a huge liability.
Well, I can tell you in Kansas, we've had district superintendents already receive calls from churches that have disaffiliated saying we need a new pastor. That's already happening. So there's already talk about how we do reaffiliation, which does not include a refund for the money that was paid to leave. So there is talk about reaffiliating, but we know this in rural Kansas. Before disaffiliations, I'd be interested in the count. We had more Methodist churches and post offices in Kansas. There was one in every single, we had 700 churches in Kansas, and there's 105 counties, so we averaged, 5 per county plus the large counties. In those areas, many of the last church standing was the United Methodist because of the appointment system, because we would send pastors in a way that the other denominations were not able to do, because their polity was congregational. And so a lot of these churches may not even care about homosexuality. They're opportunists. Yeah. They see a chance to have their church property free and clear, and they have a chance to control their pastor free and clear. I said this, I was my pastor for 19 years in Kansas City, Kansas at Trinity. I said, the best part about being Methodist, you can't fire me in the parking lot. Right? You got to call the bishop. And I made it 19 years, right? But I think that reality of being able to hire and fire your pastor on the spot is attractive to some folks. So we're going to see a lot of mixing in terms of how that goes long term for folks. But it is true, half of the churches are going independent. And that means, and that's one of the reasons the GMC, the WCA, and the Good News are working hard for General Conference to reopen disaffiliations to try to get more churches to come over to their group. So that's the challenge. So we can take questions if you want.
Mario, we got a
microphone
back there that we can pass around.
Only people of faith pass a microphone.
Name and church.
Hi, my name is Alan Stevens. I'm a member at First Austin.
Welcome.
And I have a general question, which is, how can these guys continue to be delegates if the annual conference has already said you're gone? How can they still be on the slate for jurisdictional and general conference?
It's an excellent question. I'll give you the example of John Lomperis. John Lomperis is in Indiana. He's a layperson, and he's on staff at the Institute for Religion and Democracy and writes some of the most vitriolic stuff you've ever seen in your life. John Lomperis has been a delegate in Indiana. His church disaffiliated. He found another church that he could transfer his membership to so that he could stay on the delegation. And he doesn't even live in Indiana anymore. And his behavior is so toxic, the Indiana Annual Conference passed a petition calling for him to resign and asking the General Secretary of the General Conference to disallow him to come as a delegate. And it passed by 62% of the annual conference saying this guy's got to go. But there is no provision in the Book of Discipline for removing a delegate once elected. And he meets the criteria of being a member of a church in Indiana, even though he doesn't attend there and doesn't live in the state. But he checks the box of being a member and has no integrity to leave. He's writing all the articles about why you should leave the United Methodist Church. It's a failing denomination. It's Marxist. It's pro-gay. It's everything that's wrong in the world is right here at the United Methodist Church. He's actively working against his own denomination, but will not. It's the whole do as I say, not as I do. I think Jesus had some words for that in Matthew 23. Woe to you, scribes, Pharisees, hypocrites. He's asking people to leave the church, but he won't do it himself. And he's coming as a delegate to try to extend disaffiliations.
To answer the question directly, when the church disaffiliates, it's by a vote of the congregation. More than 67% vote that way, but others didn't vote that way. And they did not leave the United Methodist Church. They will go to another church and move their membership to a church that's still United Methodist. And we're actively working on that throughout the conference, helping people find another church. So it's possible that your church disaffiliates, but you don't.
And it's possible that you disagreed with the disaffiliation. John Lamperis encouraged the disaffiliation of his church and then found another church so he could continue his work.
Maybe we talk to the pastor of his new church.
Well, I think there's an issue there too. Yes.
This is a long shot, Matt and John Wright. I'm also from First Church. Couldn't he be brought up on charges of disloyalty to the doctrine and discipline of the United Methodist Church and be dismissed as a member?
Well, and there's also another provision for undermining the ministry of a pastor. That's chargeable offense too. Our team, being centrists and progressives, are not much into trials. And so what we're good at is grace. What we're bad at is accountability, right? And so I think if we're going to make a mistake, it's going to be on grace rather than, because John Lamperis has filed charges against a number of gay pastors. He stalks gay pastors on Facebook and sends screenshots to their bishops and files charges that often get tossed out because he has no standing. He's not a member of that annual conference. But he's filed charges against countless people. So would there be some justice in filing charges against this guy? Yes, but I don't think it's going to happen. I think the hope is this is his last general conference, and the people of Indiana are not going to elect him again.
We may not have any trials, but there will be a credentials committee in North Carolina.
Yeah.
And there is the possibility that there may be some questions raised about the more obvious problem delegates.
We have a delegate, similar situation in Great Plains, Dixie Brewster. She's on the board of trustees for the Institute for Religion and Democracy and on the board of trustees for Good News. She's done a video, publicly released video, asking churches to leave our denomination. And yet she won't leave, and she's still on our delegation, and she's planning on coming to General Conference to vote to continue the disaffiliations. It's a problem.
Do you have an estimate of how many in this category?
That's a good question.
I don't think there are many.
I think it's going to be less than 20.
Yeah,
They'll have voice.
They'll have voice and vote.
yeah, if they stick.
And an outsized voice with the delegates from outside the U.S. Yeah. We have another question?
We answered all the questions.
Or they're afraid I'll keep talking. I mean, that's another reason not to ask a question.
I
All
just
right.
have an anecdotal comment. My little home church was down on the
tell them who you are, Steve.
I'm Steve Tackett from First Austin. I'm from a little home church that had 50 and under members, kind of in decline. Wonderful people. They voted to disaffiliate, broke my heart. But I had conversations with them, and they didn't leave because of LGBT. I mean, they're in a conservative town. I mean, this is just a continuation. This same church would have left over slavery if it would have been around. I mean, it just is a politically driven thing. But I actually told them I'm glad they're going to go global because they're surrounded by Southern Baptist and evangelical churches, churches that don't affiliate even with the crazy people like global, are going to wind up being taken over by other local fundamentalist groups, and they're going to lose their profit. They'll disappear, either because they can't financially sustain themselves, or their membership will just increase by very fundamental people joining them who are not Methodist or Wesleyan in any way.
Yep.
And eventually they'll lose their church that way. It's just a sad situation.
I'd be interested in asking you a question. What's your greatest hope for this church and for your annual conference?
Well, for this church, for the Westlake United Methodist Church, I hope we continue to be who we are and to welcome other people and to continue to grow as we have through the pandemic. We've got new families and new members coming in, and that's the way it ought to be. Now, for Rio, Texas, what I'm very hopeful of is that we are a very unusual conference because we're over 50% Hispanic in terms of the population, and we're still yearning toward that in our population and our congregations. So we're hopeful that we can, as we come out of the pandemic and disaffiliation, we're hopeful that we can begin to address what our population is in Rio, Texas.
Well, and I have a similar hope for our denomination. I think church is hard on a good day, right? Coming out of the pandemic, the changes in our world and nation and how the church is perceived generally, church is hard, and we need to get back to doing the work of the church. And we're not doing ourselves any favors when the thing people see in the news about the United Methodists is we're fighting about whether or not we're going to include gay and lesbian people. It's hurting our market outreach. It's hurting our public relations. It's hurting our identity. We need to move to a church that's welcoming of everyone and to get on with the business of the church, because we talk about the disaffiliation exit of the number of churches that have left, 20%. Friends, we've lost 20% on the left already. There's a lot of folks who are just done. They're not going to be a part of a church that's even talking about it. They're done. So we have lost, and my concern is if we don't change the denomination, if we don't change the language, the exodus on the left is going to accelerate, because there's going to be a lot of churches that say we just can't stay in this church. And that's one of the messages we're trying to communicate overseas, is keeping the U.S. church healthy is in everyone's best interest. And what the U.S. needs to be healthy is to move past this in a new way, so that we can stay in mission together. Regionalization is about global mission, not about global governance. We don't need to micromanage each other. We need to let each other be who we are, and we can stay in mission together. The alternative, and I just want to say something about the alternative, what's Plan B look like? Plan B is likely United Methodist USA. Very similar to the Presbyterian Church, Presbyterian USA, the Lutheran Church of America. It was very likely that we would become a U.S.-only denomination. I think we're a weaker denomination if we're U.S.-only. I think we're certainly a less diverse denomination. I would say a less faithful denomination. But if the choice is to have trials and kicking people out, or being our own U.S. denomination, I think the choice is going to be we're going to be our own U.S. denomination. Because I think we just can't abide having folks from outside the United States imposing rules on us in a way that we were unwilling to do with paragraph 101. A generation ago, we said the majority should not overrule the minority in their cultural setting. And now we're in the minority and we have to change the rules so we have that permission. So it's a pretty big deal. And so this General Conference has a lot at stake. Please stay tuned in. Please encourage people who have gone to sleep to wake up because there's a lot at stake in this General Conference. And it could be our last global General Conference if we don't find a way to work together moving forward. That makes me sad, but it also is probably real. There's a lot at stake, yeah.
I'm Bob Garrett, also from First Church, Austin.
I appreciate you're all sitting together.
Yeah, sorry. If regionalization takes a year to ratify, then that doesn't help pass the vote to remove the language from the Book of Discipline. Are the votes there to remove it without any kind of help from Africans and Filipinos?
Yes, we have enough votes in the U.S. Because of our disproportionate voting, for one more time, we have 55% of the votes. I believe we will remove the language.
But
Then-
that's the job of mainstream, to try to organize.
To make sure that
vote.
happens. There are some people who would say, well, let's not remove the language, because if we remove the language, we'll make Africa mad, and then they won't ratify the regionalization. So let's not remove the language and put all our eggs in the basket of regionalization. And so then once we're a regional section, the U.S. can remove the language. And it would take 2 or 4 more years. There are a lot of churches not willing to wait 2 or 4 more years for this harmful language to be removed. People are leaving. That's the issue. So we do have the votes to remove it, but we have to convince the U.S. delegates who are nervous about losing regionalization to vote for removing the language. You can see how complex this is.
We've got 6 months left before General Conference, and we need to reach a bunch of young delegates that don't yet fully understand how this is going to play out. That's what our job is.
I'm Hillary. I serve a church in Austin, elder. I have another complex question, and this is going to sound more negative than I mean it to. Why is it bad if disaffiliation continues?
It's a good question. It depends on where you're from in terms of how bad it is. I'd give an example of the Texas Annual Conference. There was a lot of disinformation that was given to churches to leave, saying, the United Methodist Church isn't Christian anymore. Good News actually published, Rob Renfro published an article that said we're no longer Christian, we're a different faith. A lot of lies were told and scared people in the pews to say, my gosh, we can't stay here. You're going to get assigned a gay pastor. Well, and I'd go out to rural Kansas and folks would say, well, are we going to get a gay pastor? I'm like, good news. Gay pastor didn't want to come to your town. So you're going to be fine. And more good news for you, we don't have enough gay pastors to go around, right? There just aren't that many gay pastors. So these lies that were being told to people, if you're going to have a gay pastor, you're going to have a transgendered person serving communion at your church, you're going to have, they fluff up all this culture war stuff that's ripe for the picking in this country. And they tap into all this culture war stuff and lie to people about what's happening in the United Methodist Church, and it's all a bunch of liberal radicals, which is not true. It's about people who are willing to live together with difference. That's not a particularly liberal. That's actually biblical. John 17, live in unity as Jesus is one with God. But this issue of where you're from, if you're in the Texas Annual Conference and all these lies have been told, you don't want to open the door for more lies, because there have been churches that needed to leave and pastors who needed to leave, who are all in on this issue and are want away from the Methodist Church, and they need to go. There are some churches that conferences would describe as collateral damage. that they didn't need to leave. They're fine. It's going to be fine, and it's a close vote, so just everybody relax and stay where you are. There are conferences across the South that desperately want disaffiliation to end. In the West and the Northeast, in my conversations, they're more willing to keep it open, in part because they've been ignoring the discipline for so long. For a generation, it doesn't really matter what the discipline says. They're not going to, the whole prohibitions haven't applied to New York and California for literally 30 years. So those groups are more willing to say, just let people keep leaving. The question is, when does this season end? Right? There's got to be an end time. At some point, we've got to say, no, it's like closing the casket at a funeral. I talk to families about this. Do we close it before the service? Do we close it after the service? And I've had folks that say, we can't close it. Okay, here's the reality. We're going to close the casket at some point. Let's decide when together. And so in some ways, we need to close the casket on disaffiliations and let this season move on. The question is, when does that end? Should it end now, or should it end in a year from now? The legislation that I was told by the Good News that they were writing was to leave it open until 2029.
Let me add to that, Mark, as the professional conflict manager here. What is happening in disaffiliation is not a natural process in many churches, and that's what Mark's been describing. We've seen it especially in the Southeastern Conference, that the Southeastern jurisdiction, that elements have been out driving the conflict in congregations. That's what we're seeing a hope that we're going to have an end to, is to get rid of this drive to wedge congregations apart. And where it's been a natural process, and the people in the pews have looked at each other and said, we really are not in step here. Let's move to something different. That's very easy. But where they've not really known what's going on, and they've had 2 or 3 people stand up and say things, such as Mark has described, they've caused terrible, terrible damage to congregations that are never going to be the same.
Well, you have the groups that are recruiting, all through self-interest. I mean, the Institute for Religion and Democracy wants more churches to leave because they hate denominations generally, right? They're against all denominations. The post-denominational Christianity. The Good News and WCA are actively recruiting churches for their Global Methodist Church. So it's not as if there's this neutral piece of, well, some churches need to decide, other churches don't. I would suggest every church that is against gay pastors has left. There are some churches that haven't thought about this, and if you scare them bad enough, they might change their mind. Maybe we should be scared. I didn't know I should be scared. I mean, that's the whole politics of America right now. We didn't know we should be scared.
Let's see if Hillary, did that get to what you were after?
I was just thinking it would help the numbers of folks that wanted the language removed. You had great answers. I learned a lot, but I had a more simple question.
Yeah. Well, we think we got that bump from the 2019 St. Louis convention. From here on, as Mark has described, the numbers switch on us badly once we go, because another thing we haven't mentioned is none of the African congregations could disaffiliate.
Very
the
few
way
have.
They just
few
weren't.
have.
They weren't able to.
Yeah, a few have, but not many.
They left without following the Book of Discipline,
that's right.
because the way the provision was written, it didn't apply in Africa until 12 months after the next General Conference, which didn't occur.
Well, and the irony is paragraph 2553 falls into the section from paragraph 101 that they could adapt.
Yeah.
So if they wanted to use it, they could. But I do think that, the question is, let everybody sort themselves out, right? Get the sorting hat out and get everybody in their group, and then they can be them and we can be us, and it'll be better. I do think that's already happened.
Well, Pastor, now, you've been a pastor for a long time. We have a number of pastors out here. How many out there think that their congregations are beyond the 10% that you know understood your sermon, and the other 90% out there that are still trying to figure out just exactly what it was you were trying to tell them? We're dealing with that when we go through disaffiliation in all of these issues. Our people are just diffuse in how they understand what these issues are.
Well, and you'd be surprised. I mean, I think this too. I said this to my church a number of times. Visitors are not looking for a fixer-upper when they're looking for a church. Right? That's not usually what people are looking for. And coming into a church that's at a fight is pretty unappealing. And we've lost a lot of people. I don't know if anyone here has ever seen a good church fight. I know no one here has ever participated in one, amen, but ever seen one is sometimes you lose the fighters, the group on one side or the other leaves, and then you lose a lot of people who just hate fighting. Right? They weren't even involved in this, but they saw people leave. That's upsetting, so they leave. I think we have a lot of that right now. People are upset with the fighting, and I think continuing the disaffiliations is continuing the fighting, and we're going to lose more people that just don't want to be in a church that's fighting anymore. So I think there's some merit in stopping the fight by stopping the disaffiliations and saying we are who we are.
Do we have any more questions?
Yeah.
Tracy?
Tracy Beadle, Westlake UMC. I'm afraid to ask this question because I'm afraid it's a stupid question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. So I understand why it's important for all of the delegates who will be voting at General Conference to understand all of this. My question is, those of us who are not delegates to General Conference, and I'm interested and want to know all of this, but how can we help? I mean, why is it important for us to know all of this?
I didn't plant that question.
That's a good question. She's your pastor.
Yeah. Thank you, dear. Well, first of all, it's important because we're in a representative, a Republican form of democracy in this church. We elect our leaders and they go to the General Conference and they vote together, hopefully wisely, and give us good decisions. But as we send them off, we've got to help them find their way. And of the 7 million Methodists we've got in the United States, maybe 700 or 7,000 might actually have direct input to those delegates. So what we're hoping is that we get support from our church members out there that agree that we need to get this group of American delegates together, working together, and that you'll help by donating to the mainstream UMC so that we can, first of all, work with our American delegations, but frankly, we'd like to put boots on the ground in Africa. We'd like to send people over there after the first of the year to talk to delegations directly and help them understand what we're trying to do in the U.S. And that's going to be expensive. So we need all the help we can get. If y'all know people who see this as being a mission that's worth supporting, we'd love to have that.
We also have everyone who came in, there's a sign up at the beginning. If you want more information and you don't receive our emails already, you can sign up at the table. If you signed up and didn't realize what you're getting into, you can scratch your name off on the way out if you want to. There's also a free souvenir for everyone. This is one of our cards that gives information about Mainstream UMC. There are also remittance envelopes out there that you can put a stamp on and send in support as well. So, yes.
Yeah.
I came in a few minutes late, so maybe I missed this, but
If you bring a note,
Mainstream UMC, is that a part of the UMC organization, or it's UMC people outside of the organization? And maybe you can be more specific about how you get these feet on the street. Where's the money coming from?
Sure. So Mainstream UMC, we started as a ministry of Grace United Methodist Church in Olathe, Kansas. And they agreed to do that for 1 year. And then 4 years later, they said, yeah, we're changing some things. And so we had stayed longer than we had intended. So we formed our own 501c3. So Mainstream UMC is our own 501c3. We're incorporated in the state of Kansas and have the federal tax ID status. So that's our structure. We are an advocacy group within the United Methodist Church. There used to be a couple that aren't as active right now. We're the only active one right now. That are left, that are center left. The group, and we're right and left and right of center, but within the broad umbrella of the 80% of the church. You know, there are a lot of advocacy groups. Good News, WCA, IRD are all separate organizations from the United Methodist Church that do advocacy from the right. And so we're one of the only centrist organizations. And there is Reconciling Ministries Network, tends to be a little more left, but they've been around for 40 years. We're doing this good work for 40 years. So we came along in 2018 specifically to pass the One Church plan and now to pass regionalization.
I have been working with Mark since 2018 and have been on his board. And I think it's a terrific ministry, and I'm hopeful that it can make a change in the church. Yes, it's live streamed, and we'll be putting it up for a link. I think, Tracy, right? We're going to link it up.
Yes, we will, it will be in the archives on our website, but we're also going to create a YouTube, and we'll provide the link to you, Mark.
Thank you.
To send it out.
And we have, I've done these presentations in Charlotte, North Carolina, Indianapolis, Dallas, and Kansas City. I'll be back in Kansas City again tomorrow night, and then in Omaha. And on our website, mainstreamumc.com, there's a resources page, and we put the video links of the presentations in there. So, and they tend to be about this length, an hour and a half. So if you have a study group in your church that would like to watch one of them, you can. We also have some other groups putting out videos about things that are on that resource page. So we try to provide resources for local churches so that they can, so you can have this conversation in your local church.
Thank you all for being here.
Yeah,
Thank you online for being here.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Jay. Appreciate it.